I'm going to talk a little bit maybe to the class side of this equation and broaden out the historical context. I don't have the real Chicago-specific stuff. And part of what I was doing, by the way, for 10 years in South Florida was studying the gentrification of a Puerto Rican neighborhood in Miami, Florida, that goes by the name of Wynwood. If anyone's ever heard of Art Basel and sort of this global art scene that's developed and emerged in Miami, and you have any questions or curious about that, I can speak to that a little bit more later.
Interesting.
So if you could just go to the next slide. I'm starting off here with this quote from Ruth Glass also because this has been sort of the coining of the term, right? It's always referred to as where gentrification comes from, but I think as it's now well established, gentrification has a much broader and much longer history. And so what I'd like to just talk about is how it's really, of course, embedded in the broader capitalist system, and that gentrification is tied up with the way that the building of cities has always solved two crises in capitalist economics, right? Or I'm sorry, it's always solved cyclical crises in the capitalist economy in two particular ways. Capitalism is trying to expand markets either by expanding overseas, outward, or by expanding inward by redeveloping space and giving it new meaning and infusing it with new ideas of who are people and who are unpeople, who have value and who don't have value. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to go a little bit further back to one of the first really historic examples of the way that capitalist economics fixes this crisis in those couple of ways. And it starts, one particular example that's really momentous in history also because the resistance to it was what happened in Napoleon's Paris in the middle of the 1800s. Napoleon had an architect, urban planner, public works manager by the name of Haussmann. And during the economic crisis of the 1840s, Napoleon was working to fix that crisis, one, by expanding overseas. There was the development of the Suez Canal, the involvement of the French in that, but sort of more inwardly. If you go to the next slide, please. Haussmann planned to create the city of light that is now Paris with all the boutiques and cafes and broad boulevards by destroying all the working class districts in the center, which were overcrowded, which had been abandoned, which had sewage issues. These are some of the images from that. If you could go to the next slide, please, you can see some of the differences between that pre-1850s, 60s, 70s Paris and what it looks like today. And so this was one of the ways that the particular economic crisis in Paris at that time was solved. There was a new market for the consumption of space. New value was given to it in addition to expanding overseas. That part of it I won't talk about. If you go to the next slide, please. Just another couple of images to give you an example of the difference. So this really goes back to also the role of government. Jesse talked a lot about urban renewal. We've had multiple waves of the role of our state and federal governments in helping to bring profitability back to urban land, not for the people that live there, right, but for investors. And the role of the state has been very important in that, and that's an important point to remember. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just zoom forward a little bit, talk about some of the sort of more recent phases in the way that gentrification has played out since the period that we associated with the beginning of gentrification in the 60s. One phase was the response to urban renewal that came from sort of patrician elites, people who still had downtown real estate interests in cities across the US, as well as higher educated middle class folks that started to develop a historic preservation movement to preserve historic architecture. All of that was very well-meaning. It's very associated with people, for example, like Jane Jacobs in New York, in that post-war period. And all of it was very well-intentioned to preserve the architecture of buildings, but it was fundamentally became about buildings and not about people. And today, many of you can probably attest to the way that historic preservation indeed has become a tool to gentrify neighborhoods, right? With its focus on restoring history, but not preserving space for people and the values that it brings, the use values, as you pointed out, that distinction between use value and exchange value. Another phase that Jesse talked about a little bit was the spread to sort of college-educated middle classes and how suburbanization created a wave of a new middle class that was eventually going to move back into cities and create a lot of consumer demand, and sort of the most recent phase in which art has been associated with the gentrification of cities. And in a very interesting book by Sharon Zukin on loft living, talks about how this art market, artists were not initially valued, right, as a group of people, as a demographic that would come to cities and bring value. That was transformed through media, through the scene of loft living, through the kind of mass marketing of consumption in Soho, in New York in the 1970s and 1980s. So if you go to the next slide, please. So as I was mentioning a moment ago, we had a history of urban renewal. Could you click down once?
Okay.
Robert Moses, the planner and designer of our interstate highway system, who helped push forward the highway system, and also that period coincided with the suburbanization and the creation of a mass consumer market for the suburbs. We cannot disentangle gentrification from that, right? Because the white flight that was created then generated the disinvestment in our inner cities. And there were movements to resist that, as I was mentioning a moment ago. Eventually those movements have become some of the ideological justification for gentrification today. Could you go to the next slide, please? A sort of movement around the authenticity of place was created, where certain kind of places were deemed authentic, and there was discourses about what defined people as deserving to be, what is the real thing, what are the real neighborhoods deserving of preservation, and what were all the rest of the neighborhoods that didn't deserve to be preserved and protected from the bulldozer. Go to the next slide, please. In that second phase that I was mentioning, and that Richard Florida has written about, the rise of a creative class, a class of professional, highly educated people, there's a whole sort of policy network for promoting what city mayors can do to bring young creative folks, like many of us, to live in cities and to redevelop cities. And as you know, this has become a policy mandate in cities across the country. Next slide, please. Just mentioning one more slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
Florida, of course, is known for flying around the country, giving policy advice to local policymakers, proposing sort of how people can get their creative class share increased. Next slide, please. And in the 1970s and 80s, through the work of sort of art parties, through the conversion of those old manufacturing lofts into open art spaces, and the marketing of that, the aggressive marketing of that, and the transformation of the art market as well, because one of the things that happened was that contemporary art started to become something that was accessible, and artists themselves accessible, including individuals and celebrities like Andy Warhol, in some of the party spaces that were being generated through, in some cases, artist organizations that were battling displacement on the one hand, but also contributing and helping to create a mass market for the consumption of art in the inner city, which made the inner city an exciting, sexy, livable place. Go to the next slide, please. And while this was a model that was at one point initiated through artist organizations, in cities like Miami, it's now just become a business plan that actually have nothing to do with artists. So for example, in Miami, people talk a lot about a Miami model. The Miami model essentially means real estate developers that buy up huge swaths of neighborhoods. And in cities like Miami, where you don't have large, well-endowed public museums, the consumption of art is taking place in large warehouses that used to be garment manufacturing centers, where wealthy people are buying up these warehouses, inviting the public to consume art, and there are no artists involved in the actual gentrification, right? So it's a sort of from above arts model of gentrification, inspired in some of the earlier struggles of artists to resist displacement elsewhere. And this has become known as the Miami model. It's a corporate art-led model. And so when you look at festivals like Art Basel Miami, that model is being repeated elsewhere all over the world. Miami's also, of course, been known for the muraling all over the walls there. Muraling has also been historically a way to promote local culture, unite people, and generate resistance, or at least recognition and respect, right, for a local community. But this muraling that you see on these walls is being paid for by developers like David Lombardi or Tony Goldman, who first cut his teeth in Philadelphia and in Soho in New York, and then moved his gentrification, art-associated gentrification model to Miami, and now flies in artists from all over the world for an event called Primary Flight, where the artists are paid for to come, spend 2 or 3 days, spend a couple nights on the beach, put up all these murals in November, and then they do this year after year after year. And so I see in Atlanta initiatives like Living Walls, ideas like this spreading around the country. And they are sort of from above business models, right, for how to gentrify areas associated with art. Next slide.
Yeah.
What's that?
Milwaukee Avenue Arts Festival.
Something similar is going on here too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like literally.
Next slide, please.
Yeah.
The beginning of it.
This is just another image of what I was talking about. Those are a couple of those artists that are flown in for a couple of days. I thought it was interesting that you have this sort of alter ego, right? Because there's 2 sides to what's actually going on in Miami. Next slide, please. So just to make a couple of remarks about resistance to gentrification. I wanted to, as I said in the beginning, mentioning the class side of the equation of this, just note that there's cities across the world that have been able to take huge proportions of their housing off of the private market. And historically, when you look at how that was done, it was usually done through alliances between tenant organizations and labor unions, right, and workers' organizations. And it was through the connection between workers' organizations and community organizations that those battles were fought and won. And just the last slide I wanted to show you was, in comparing the proportion of subsidized housing in a few different cities across the world, we can see where Chicago ranks. You know, we know that New York City has somewhat of a history of developing cooperative housing, limited equity cooperative housing, co-op city in the Lower East Side. A lot of that came out of the amalgamated clothing workers unions in the 1920s, right? The work of labor organizations and to be able to house their members in affordable ways and ways that were community controlled, democratically controlled housing options made a big difference. And even though there's been a lot of erosion of that affordable housing in the last 50, 60 years, the fact that it exists, it allows us something to be fighting to protect. And so you can see that Paris and Amsterdam and some of the other cities have really high proportions of affordable housing. And it's not to say that we're too late or that Chicago doesn't have the opportunity to develop those options. The housing crisis have reached such epic proportions in those cities that that's when sort of more broad-based coalitions got involved in developing that kind of housing. So I just wanted to point to the fact that it's not only the neighborhood-based block-by-block, property-by-property fights, right? But sort of broader worker and community organizations struggling together. So I'll leave it there, and thanks for having me.